Ranking every Souls game from worst to best. I was going to watch this. I saw this got recommended to me, and I was going to take a look at it.
Today I'm going to be ranking every single Souls game from worst to best in my own personal opinion and explaining why I like some games more than others. This list changes a lot for me, but here's what I think right now. Coming in at number 7, my least favorite game in the Souls series is Demon Souls. Interestingly enough, I also think it's the easiest game in the series. To be fair,
It's not even a question. Demon Souls is 100% the easiest game in the series. Like, 100%. Like, it's a joke. There's no hard boss in Demon Souls except maybe Flame Lurker, and even that's pretty fucking easy. I do think that Demon Souls is better than Dark Souls 2, though. I absolutely think that. The reason why I think that is that it just plays way better. Like, I played and I'm talking about the remake Demon Souls. I never played the original, but the remake Demon Souls plays incredibly well, and because of how fluid and well it plays, it just makes it a better game than Dark Souls 2 because of that alone.
I've only played the remake since I don't have a PS3. Sorry, I was too busy pushing children out of my way at Walmart to get a PS5. I probably ruined like 3 kids' Christmases last year, but I got to play Demon Souls, so, you know, silver lining. Anyway, as much as I love this game and was surprised at how well the gameplay held up after all this time, I still think it comes in last place for me due to the bosses. And I've said this before, I don't think the bosses are bad in this game at all. I'm just not a huge fan of the gimmick puzzle bosses, and that describes 90% of the ones in Demon.
How long did S-Fan spend on this boss? It was like fucking, like 7 hours or something like that, right? Dragon God? Man, I remember that. That was a dark day. That was a dark fucking day. Yeah, hours. Yep. I think that Demon Souls was fucking amazing. I love Demon Souls.
Last time I mentioned that, a ton of people were like,
you'd rather just have a dodging simulator? That's all just reaction time. It takes no skill at all.
yeah.
I think that there's a little bit of a middle ground. All of the Demon Souls bosses are incredibly easy, and I think that some of them are probably too easy, but overall, I mean, you've got to keep in mind, like, I played Demon Souls after I played Sekiro and Bloodborne, so big surprise, it was easy to me.
I don't care, it's more fun. I really love the world in this game though, and I think the level design is excellent. It's just not as fleshed out for obvious reasons, and after playing the others, it definitely showed. Certain things like
That's definitely true.
The 525,600 upgrade mats get annoying, especially with the drop rates being ridiculously low for some. I grinded so much on my first playthrough, I pretty much just do New Game Plus now. The world tendency stuff is fun to mess around with sometimes, but most of the time I forget to...
The world tendency was stupid, and there's a reason why they never did it in any game following Demon Souls. It was dumb.
Skydive in the Nexus, leaving me wondering why I'm all of a sudden trash at the game. On top of everything else, the game is pretty short. It took me like 15 hours to beat it the first time through, and that was during finals week of my last semester of college, but, you know, priorities. I
would say so. I think the game is definitely, it's much shorter, it's a lot easier. I would say Demon Souls might be about as long as Dark Souls 1, not counting DLC. Maybe, but I don't know.
So yeah, I find myself coming back to this game more than some of the others, but I think it's because it feels less stressful than the others, and the world is really immersive to me. And to be fair, my rankings change pretty much every time I play these games again, so this is my current list after completing each game a few times. Okay. So yeah, Demon Souls is last in my mind as of right now, but like I said, it's almost entirely due to the bosses. Next up on my list is Dark Souls 1. I know, get your little hate comment finger.
Yeah, definitely. We're gonna get hate comments for this. I think Dark Souls 1 is it's like the second or third best game they've made. I think all things considered, it definitely is.
Ready. If I was being objective, Dark Souls 1 would probably rank a bit higher on this list, but after my last playthrough, I really just didn't enjoy it as much as the others. I think a lot of this is due to the slower pace of the game with the rolling and running and healing, but it ended up frustrating me more than anything after playing the other games. The combat in this game just never gave me the same rush as the other games, especially with the bosses. Once again, most of them just felt too...
I would say that, okay, so Dark Souls 1 bosses, I think that the gameplay from the beginning of Dark Souls 1 up until you finish Anne Orlando and you talk to the big titty girl and everything, you do Ornstein and Smo, I think that gameplay, like that part of the game, is like the best gameplay experience any Dark Souls or Souls game has ever had. It is perfect. After that, I will agree, it gets worse. But from the beginning of the game up until and including Anne Orlando, it is the best game of all time.
Easy up until the DLC, where the slow rolls actually started bothering me because they really stepped up the boss fights there. But even with my complaint,
let's see, are there hard bosses in the base game? Like Bed of Chaos was really bad. Like everybody admits, it's a bad boss. There's nothing else really to say besides that. Let me think. 4 Kings is easy. I think probably Ornstein and Smo are probably the hardest. It's the hardest fight in there. Not non-DLC. Yeah, actually I would probably say Capra Demon is probably the hardest for like whenever you encounter the Capra Demon in the game.
I can't deny how incredible the interconnectivity is in this game, and I think it would have been bumped up a few spots if it had continued through the second half of the game as well.
Yeah.
There's also just a lot of downtime and running around, which can definitely be fun to a certain extent, but I think they executed that part better in the later games. The boss fights just felt slow, and fighting multiple enemies is such a pain in this game due to your speed, which makes it hard for me to enjoy it as much after playing the other games.
I feel like every single game, it's always annoying to play any Souls game whenever you're fighting more than one target. Like, it doesn't matter if it's Sekiro, Dark Souls 1, Dark Souls 2, or Demon Souls, or Bloodborne. These games are not made to be fighting multiple targets, and it is annoying to do so.
I think the story is really strong here, so it's a shame I don't really care about it at all. I just like to play. What? It's a video game. I think this game was executed perfectly for the time and will always be known as one of the most iconic experiences in all of gaming, but in comparison to the rest of the series, it's gonna rank second to last.
Okay, so if I'm thinking, I think that this guy is basically ranking it off of like the actual gameplay and like the challenges that the game provides. So I think the next one's probably going to be Dark Souls 2, and then maybe Dark Souls 3 after that. And then actually it might be Bloodborne and then Dark Souls 3. He probably might rank Bloodborne a little bit lower. And then probably Sekiro and or Elden Ring. Like Sekiro number 1, Elden Ring number 2, or vice versa. That's what I think he'll probably pick, but I don't know.
For me. Coming in at number 5, we actually have Bloodborne. No, I'm just kidding. Please hold your comments and questions and subscribe right now until the end.
Clever.
Number 5 is going to be Dark Souls 2. I almost put this one a little bit higher, but when I went back to play it, I just couldn't. Also,
It's a bad game. Like, I don't know why so many people struggle with accepting this obvious fact that Dark Souls 2 is a bad game. Like, it's a fundamentally bad game. Like, the systems inside of the game are bad. The bosses are bad. The world design is bad. The mob placement is bad. Like, I don't know what you want me to say.
These are all in order so far, but I have a feeling that'll change soon. Dark Souls 2 almost ranked a bit higher for me because it was by far the most addicted I've ever been to a video game, and I genuinely have no idea why. I played Dark Souls 1 and 3 first, and for some reason this game just got me. This one I actually started during finals week of my junior year in college, and within 3 days I had over 24 hours played in Dark Souls 2.
That's 8 hours a day. Like, what is that supposed to be a big deal? Like, oh wow, you played a game for 8 hours a day? Like, what is this casual shit?
To say, I had to hit a couple professors up asking if they could round my D- to a B+, but that's why I'm a YouTuber now. All that aside, I really just love the world in this game and the freedom they give you. It feels like a different form of exploration from Dark Souls 1. It's almost hopeful in a sense. They kind of give you hints at things you'll discover later on in the game, so it keeps you interested to find out what happens.
There are some really interesting things about Dark Souls 2, and if they remade Dark Souls 2 and made it just a better game, like, fix some of the annoying things about it. Like, for example, like really long boss runbacks, fixing the weird thing where you lose health whenever you die, fix hitboxes. I actually think the game would be great. I don't think that the game has a... Like, I think there's a way you can redeem it, but you would just have to do it from the ground up, I think.
Jula is also the best hub in the series with the best music. Don't at me. Does anyone even say that anymore? And I hate to say it, but I kind of like the quantity approach they did here to some extent. The only reason it ranks lower is because the controls still feel a bit clunky. The agility stat
I think having more bosses in the game was not a big deal. I don't think it's a problem in the same way that I don't think it was a problem that Elden Ring reused a lot of the bosses for like the cave bosses and stuff like that, right? Sometimes it's just like 2 or 3 normal mobs, but they have a lot of health. I think that's okay. It's not a big deal.
dumb and makes the first part of the game frustrating, and the bosses are pretty weak for the most part. It also has some of the...
Yeah, Dark Souls 2 gets easier the longer you play it, and the only exception to that is whenever you're in the DLC. The DLC in Dark Souls 2 is really good, and it's probably the best DLC out of any game except for maybe Bloodborne. It's the best comparatively, I will say that for sure, because Bloodborne was good besides the DLC also, but like Dark Souls 2 I think was bad besides the DLC. The DLC was in general good content.
Most aggravating levels, enemies, bosses, you name it. But I still love it for that reason. Oh, and also the fashion, weapon variety, and unique additions like the bonfire aesthetics and fragrant branches of yore are absolutely beautiful. Moving on to
doing a bunch of weird stuff is good.
Number 4, this is where it gets a little bit interesting. Once again, get those little typers ready because we're going with Elden Ring. I don't think I need to explain this one much more. Elden Ring is an incredible game, but I personally prefer a bit more direction in my games, specifically how FromSoft does it, because I think it makes for a more balanced experience. The open world was an awesome feature, and I'd love to see them do it again in the future, but I kind of prefer there being a little bit more structure for games like this. A lot of the mini bosses were way too easy for me, and it felt like a waste because if they were harder, it would have given me a lot more playtime. But then if I try to keep myself under leveled, the main bosses become way too challenging. It's just a balance I couldn't really find on my own, and it took away from a lot of my enjoyment in Elden Ring. Aside from that though, the game feels great. The open world is super fun to explore. There is an absurd...
I think that's kind of one of the good things about the game, like in my opinion, is that if you run into a wall, you can just start going and doing something else instead and exploring in a different direction, and you can do that too. I think that's one of the better things about the game. And I think also, like, that was probably one of the better and also worst things about the game, depending on what kind of a player you were whenever the game actually came out, is that I do think it would be probably a little bit better if there was a bit more direction leading up to what's his name, like Margit, because like people probably just go directly to him, they get destroyed, and they quit the game. Like, that's not a very good gameplay loop. So like maybe if they did more to like encourage you to do other stuff before you fought him. But again, that's kind of like what the nature of these games is for it to be a very open-ended experience that you can experience the way that you want. But yeah, I disagree with this. I think that I think Elden Ring, especially in terms of gameplay, there are so many different ways you can play the game. Like magic works, using a bow and arrow works, big weapons work, small weapons work, you have power stancing. I think there's just so many positive things to Elden Ring that you just can't even, it would take a long time for me to list them as like comparative advantages versus other games. Yeah, it's way, way better.
Amount of content that's worth way more than the price tag, and it's gotta be game of the year this year. The weapon and build variety is so much fun to mess around with as well, and I love all the little features they added to make the game more convenient.
But there are people that just simply do not like, they don't like open world games, and it is what it is.
The problem I had that I've touched on before is the bosses. It feels like they do too much damage to you but don't have enough health, as opposed to the other games where bosses do less damage to the player but have massive health pools. I'd rather have more.
Is that true? Bosses have a lot of health. I will say that the Melania fight, I didn't like the fact that it was so built around that one ability, the waterfowl dance. Like where she like goes up in the air and like spins around. Because if you took that ability out, you would probably reduce the amount of wipes that every player has against this boss by like 70 or 80%. And I think it is kind of, what's the word for it? It's kind of like, it's gimmicky whenever there's just this really, really hard mechanic to do. But other than that, the boss isn't really that challenging. So I don't think Melania is that great of a boss because her difficulty is built completely around one mechanic.
More room for error but a longer fight than a boss that will one-shot me instantly if I mess up. I could talk about the pros and cons of this game forever, but I think most FromSoft fans will see where I'm coming from here. I'm not taking anything away from Elden Ring at all. It's just a different type of game than the others. Coming in at number...
Yeah, it definitely is. I would say so. As I said before, I think Elden Ring is my number one.
3, we have Dark Souls 3. This might be a shocker, I know, but keep in mind that it was my first Souls game ever, and have you seen the bosses? This one is extremely biased being my first Souls game, and I'll never forget beating the Abyss Watchers for the first time and getting that rush that makes these games so addicting.
Really? Whenever I beat the Abyss Watchers, I thought I didn't even know the fight was over. Like, that shit was easy. Yeah, Dark Souls 3 fucks so hard. Yeah, Dark Souls 3, well, I mean, like, it's not a surprise that every single game mod basically uses Dark Souls 3, or this is until Elden Ring at least, used Dark Souls 3 as the foundation. Dark Souls 3 has the most things that you can do. Is we good? Is we good? We good. All right, good. So yeah, Dark Souls 3 I think is probably the best out of all three of the Dark Souls games. I will say, however, that I prefer Dark Souls 1, but that's probably just because I played it a lot and I just have like more nostalgia. I like the world interconnectedness of it. Dark Souls 3 has that, but to a much lesser extent. I think Dark Souls 1 is... I think Dark Souls 3 is a better game, but I like Dark Souls 1 more.
The movement in this game feels great, and I know a lot of people were pissed because the rolls were too fast, but I think they paired this with faster combat to offset the change. Yeah, also, don't be a boomer, embrace the change, come on. I will say, after completing all the Souls games, it's definitely one of the easiest, but some of the bosses still give me the most trouble of any game in the series. The endgame...
I don't think so. I think that, honestly, Lorien, like the fucking two princes, this fight is actually hard. I think that Manus is in Dark Souls 1. I think that Gale is actually hard. I think that Nameless King is pretty hard. Like, I would say any of these bosses are harder than any boss in Dark Souls 1 or 2. And also, like, Midir. Like, all these bosses are harder than any boss in Dark Souls 1 or 2.
And DLC bosses feel perfectly balanced and give you that feeling of satisfaction that drives us all to say get good to the random kids struggling on the internet. I will say I think most of the levels are pretty unpleasant. If they were any better, Dark Souls 3 would have been my #1 spot. Pretty much all the levels leading up to Irithyll are a pain to go through, not because they're super hard or complicated, they just don't feel super creative or exciting to explore.
Personally, I love the levels in Dark Souls 1 or Dark Souls 3. I think they're great.
Small issue I have is how easy it is to R1 spam through most of the enemies in this game. It's not
apparently this guy watched my playthrough.
Huge problem or anything, but it definitely makes the game feel like a joke at times. But I still think this game has some of the best and worst enemies in the series, which made it a bit harder to rank for me. It has some of the highest highs and the lowest lows, but it's probably the game I've completed the most just because the bosses are...
I think that Wolnir isn't a bad boss fight. I don't think that boss fights are only hinged... Like, the quality of the boss fight is hinged on its difficulty. And I think that's what a lot of people do. They say, oh, this boss fight is bad because it's really easy. I don't think that's the case. There's a lot of boss fights that are easy, but they're awesome.
So damn good. This was a perfect way to end the trilogy, and it's my favorite of the 3 Dark Souls games. Before we get to #2, just give me 10 seconds to show you something that'll make your life a lot better. If you want to get access to games and DLCs early or watch shows you normally couldn't get access to, you can get Atlas VPN right now for only $1.99 per month.
Wow.
Use the link in the description and try it out now. The deal isn't going to last long. Thanks to Atlas VPN for sponsoring the video. Let's get on to #2. Coming in at
W for the fact that it's not that long of an ad. Okay, thank you.
At #2, the runner-up is gonna be Bloodborne. I'm assuming most of you expected this to be #1, but it has a few things that bumped it down for me.
I think Bloodborne has a number of things wrong with it. #1, the fact that it's fucking 30 FPS. It just plays like shit. Yeah, that's a huge problem. Yeah, the FPS for the game is bad.
Understand why a lot of the huge beast bosses were included here, but I personally prefer the humanoid bosses like Gehrman and Lady Maria, and I wish they had more like them. But the ones they do...
let's see. The beast bosses... I think his name's like Parl, like Dark Beast Parl. I think that boss was really bad because it was so dark, it was hard to see what he was doing. Let's see, Elbridis, that's what it is. Elbridis, like, that is actually, I think, one of the best bosses in all of the series. And that's one of the really large bosses, too. I think that's okay. Yeah, Ludwig, same thing. Amygdala. Amygdala is a horrible boss. It's probably one of the worst designed bosses that they've ever made. I think it's probably, if I were to rank all of the bosses, it would be probably the worst or one of the worst. It's horrible.
Do have are some of the best in the series, and they never
Camera
get
Nightmare.
old for
Yeah,
me.
exactly.
The setting and theme of this game is a big part of my love, and I think the way they design the world is incredible. On top
Yeah,
of that, the level design
true.
is amazing, and the way they connected the world was mind-blowing every time. I think everyone loves this game for its horror theme, and it's a shame they still haven't made a remaster. Let's be honest, it's basically a free $70 from all of us if they just remaster the game. One thing I didn't...
He's not wrong. Like, literally all they have to do is just make a PC version of the game, update the graphics a little bit, give it more than 30 FPS, and everybody will buy the game. It's literally that simple. Is Bluepoint making a Bloodborne remake? I hope they do, because honestly, I think the Demon Souls remake was fucking perfect.
like about this game is how confusing it can be. I've played through Bloodborne tons of times, and I swear I still have to look something up at least once in every playthrough. And before you call me an idiot in the...
Yeah, I agree with this. I think Frenzy, for example, like the Frenzy mechanic in Bloodborne is absolutely horrible, and it makes the game worse. If you took Frenzy out of Bloodborne, the game would immediately be better.
Comments, I still have feelings. Actually, I'm kind of desensitized at this point, but still, I don't want to hear it. The other issues I have with this game are small things that I've touched on before, but things like the finite healing system, trying to farm for blood vials and bullets can be a pain if you use them up early. Not being...
Yeah, I would argue, like, that's probably true. Like, having to have all the blood vials and using them all the time, yeah, that probably sucks. I think that it's worse whenever you first start off in the game. It would be better if, for example, you were only able to buy like 10 at a time, and then later on you unlock 20, the same as like you did in Dark Souls 1 with like the Estus flasks. Because it does really kind of suck whenever you first start off the game, and then you have to go farm like for a long period of time to get all the stuff back. You can just buy them. Yeah, well, it's a lot easier to buy them once you're farther in the game because they have a fixed cost.
Able to rest or travel from lamps is a pain as well, but that's really more of an inconvenience. The Chalice dungeons
That's
are
true.
one aspect that most people seem to hate, but I actually don't mind them. Sure, they can be a grind, but when you've played through the main game a dozen times already, it's kind of nice to have something optional to switch it up. But I think the core combat elements in this game and the rally system are what really make it great, and I'd love to see this return in a different style, like a Western or a futuristic game from the developers in the future. Or just Bloodborne 2. Anyway, moving on to the one that's gonna piss everyone off the most because it's not even technically a Souls game, we have Sekiro.
Yeah.
This went from my least favorite FromSoft game to my favorite in the span of about 6 months. It took me forever to get into this game because I kept trying to play it like a Souls game, but on my third...
Yeah, I had the same thing happen. I spent 8 hours on Lady Butterfly because I didn't parry her at all. And then after I learned how the parry and deflect system worked, I killed her in like 3 tries.
attempt at playing it through again, the combat finally clicked with Genichiro. The level design, the combat flow, and the bosses all make this game absolutely perfect for me, and while this became my #1 FromSoft game fairly recently, I think it's gonna stay like that for a while. A lot of people...
I would argue that Sekiro is a perfect game. There is almost nothing wrong with Sekiro. I'm trying to think, like, what would I really say is problematic about Sekiro? Like, I would also say that Elden Ring is a perfect game, too. In my opinion, I would rank them Elden Ring 1, Sekiro 2, Dark Souls 3 would be 3, Bloodborne 4, Dark Souls 1 would be after that, then Demon Souls, and then Dark Souls 2. That's what I would rank them.
People dislike the lack of build variety and say it gives less replayability, but I don't know why I feel like I can keep playing this game over and over without getting sick of it.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that is definitely true, right? You compare this to Elden Ring or you compare it to Dark Souls 3, and in those games, there's like 8 different ways to solve a problem. With Sekiro, there's like maybe 2 or 3. I do think that obviously having the prosthetic items does make it more interesting and more unique, and you can do different things in Sekiro. It's not like you can't, but it's absolutely not as open-ended as the other games. And I think that's also a good thing that it goes for it too, because that makes it to where obviously the challenges in the game ramp up and it's much better balanced. Because like when a lot of the games, either the bosses at the end are super hard and the beginning ones are super easy, or vice versa. Like with Dark Souls 1, where all the beginning bosses are really hard, or Dark Souls 2, and then by the time that you get to the end of the game, it's like you're just it's like cosmetic bosses. Yeah, and so having less build variety, I think actually made not only Sekiro, but also Bloodborne much better tuned and much better balanced.
Boss rush mode really solidified this choice for me as well, giving me the opportunity to fight bosses over and over and really master each one of them. The way I describe this game is the hardest to learn but the easiest to master. And once you master it, it doesn't get boring, it just gets more satisfying. In the other Souls games, if something is too easy, it's just not that fun. In Sekiro, it still gives you that rewarding feeling for each boss because you know their moves so well. The only thing that makes me
I do think that overall in Sekiro, like, if you know exactly the way the bosses work, you can have a better mastery of the game. And I would also say that watching somebody who's really, really good at Sekiro is probably more interesting than watching somebody who's really, really good at Dark Souls 3 or Bloodborne.
debate if this game will stay at number 1 for me is the lack of content. The main game has tons of things to do, but I really wish they added a DLC or some extra prosthetics to grind for. I think the skills and prosthetic tools are good to give players that feeling of build variety because you can use each one to your advantage for specific bosses, but I would have loved at least some new weapons like a spear or some daggers. But I think this is the most consistent game in the series and is the closest to perfect I've seen in a video game. Also, someone asked if I could do an outro for this video, and I said,
why would you take a...
Okay. Okay, that's a good one. All right. Very fucking funny. So yeah, I don't know. I think that Elden Ring being number 4, I definitely disagree with this. I think that Elden Ring is better than Dark Souls 3 in pretty much every single way. But I mean, if you like Bloodborne or you like Sekiro more than Elden Ring, the gameplay of those games is so much different than like a traditional Souls Elden Ring type game that it makes sense to me that you would like that. But I think personally, like, I know that it's become like this like popular hipster thing to dislike Elden Ring because it's super popular. But yeah, I think Elden Ring is the best game they've ever made, and there's no other game that's even remotely close to it. That's all there is to it. It is the best game, all things considered. I think the combat in Sekiro is probably more precise and a little bit better than Elden Ring, but I think that everything else considered, Elden Ring is overall a better game. Yeah, I think everything is worse than Elden Ring than Dark Souls 3. I mean, I definitely don't think so. Yeah, no fucking shot. Zero utility on ranking them against each other because you can play them all. Well, I think it's just people talking about the advantages and disadvantages of each game. I think that makes sense. But I would absolutely say that, like, for what it is, Sekiro and Elden Ring are perfect games. I don't think that Bloodborne is a perfect game. I don't think that Dark Souls 3 is a perfect game. And I think that because of that, I don't think that it makes sense to rank either one of those as number 1. The only exception is, like, maybe you can rank Dark Souls 1 as a perfect game based off of, like, the narrative and world building, but that's something that's a lot different from, like, the actual game itself. So ranking his games is too personal, to be honest. Yeah. And I hate Elden Ring because I suck and I don't understand the game and I never gave it a second chance. Yep, that's probably the way that most people that don't like Elden Ring feel. That's about right. I like better about Bloodborne and Sekiro and Elden Ring. It's still awe-inspiring. Let's see. Is there things that I like better about Bloodborne? I like the visceral attack thing. I think it's cool being able to use the gun. Yeah, that's a cool gimmick, for sure. Quantum in chat? Yeah, there you go. Issue is Elden Ring for a Souls player. It's so easy to overlevel. I mean, you're not going to overlevel Malenia, okay? Like, you're not going to overlevel a lot of the endgame bosses just because of how much fucking damage they do. Like, you're still going to have to do the mechanics unless you play a different build. And I think also, for all of the other Souls games, it's really easy to overlevel every game. Like, there was not a single Souls game that I played that everybody in my chat was not spamming overleveled. That's a fact. Yeah, it's Bloodborne removes shields and being passive altogether. Yeah, that's actually a good point. It definitely does. Elden Ring late game is not perfect, especially the Hail Tree. Enemy placement is bad. Also think the bosses at the end come too thick and fast. Let's see. The Hail Tree. Yeah, there's like that one where you have to fight all those ants at the same time. That is really annoying. There's a few other things with that, sure. Yeah, I don't know. Hard time over leveling in Sekiro. Yeah, and that's again why Sekiro is the best balanced game. I'll go ahead and I'll link this video. That way you guys can take a look at it. I'll read some of the comments too. And I'll actually play just a little bit of Elden Ring, because then I'm going to have dinner with my dad, okay? Sekiro is amazing. The game shocked me. Quality and story, everything is favorite from software game. Might as well be my favorite game of all time. Really glad to see the love that it deserves. There you go. Giving Sekiro the love it's due. Feels the most lively out of all the From Software games. Yeah, I think that ranking Sekiro above Elden Ring is understandable. I can understand why somebody would do that, and I can even understand why somebody would rank Bloodborne above Elden Ring, but I think there is no argument that I have heard that tells me that Elden Ring is better than any of the Dark Souls games, and it's certainly, is not better than all of the Dark Souls games and also Demon Souls.